This episode is sponsored by a company who has truly found a solution to an age-old problem, and that is Carna bunker gear. One of the most prevalent conversations in the fire service is should we or should we not train in our bunker gear? Now, the answer to both is yes. As most of us are aware, the carcinogens from structure fires, of which there are over 260 that are dangerous to human health, not to mention the PFAS and other chemicals that are within our gear from the manufacturing process, are factors that we obviously want to minimize. Now, the other side of the coin is that we do need to train in our gear. There is no way to acclimatize the heat retention and lack of mobility than to actually wear the gear. So seeing this problem himself, firefighter and exercise physiologist Ryan Conley developed a carcinogen-free gear at a much lower cost that can be used in non-IDLH atmosphere and training that does not require puncture or tear resistance. Now, as someone who always trained in gear myself throughout my career, I wish this technology was around then. And I got to test it personally while coaching my tactical athlete class a few weeks ago, and can testify that it not only simulates the heat retention of frontline gear, but also the lack of mobility, which is imperative at operating at a high level on the fireground. Now, some additional benefits include being able to doff the gear when you do get banged out for a call, increasing the lifespan of your frontline bunker gear, and then also public education. Think of the number of times that we allow, for example, school children to wear our gear when it's infused with all these carcinogens. So there are so many real-world applications for a fraction of the cost of IDLH-rated bunker gear. So if you want to hear the whole story behind this, listen to my conversation with Ryan Conley on episode 1175 of the Behind the Shield podcast, or go to carnabunkergear.com. Welcome to the Behind the Shield podcast. As always, my name's James Gearing, and this week it is my absolute honor to welcome on the show Navy veteran, former NASA engineer, computer scientist, and founder and chief executive officer emeritus of the Institute for Human and Machine Cognition, Dr. Ken Ford. Now, in this conversation, we discuss a host of topics, from his journey into the military, the genesis of military computing, his unique perspective on future moon landings and getting to Mars, human performance in the first responder professions, sleep and performance, the firefighter shift that will forge health, recruitment, and retention, exciting innovations in technology, and so much more. One thing we didn't mention in this conversation is Ken also hosts their own podcast called STEM Talk, which you can find on the IHMC website. So before we get to this incredible conversation, as I say every week, please just take a moment. Go to whichever app you listen to this on, subscribe to the show, leave feedback, and leave a rating. Every single 5-star rating truly does elevate this podcast, therefore making it easier for others to find. And this is a free library of well over 1,200 episodes now. So all I ask in return is that you help share these incredible men and women's stories so I can get them to every single person on planet Earth who needs to hear them. So with that being said, I introduce to you Dr. Ken Ford. Enjoy. Well, Ken, I want to start by saying thank you so much for taking the time and coming on the Behind the Shield podcast today.
It's absolutely my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
So where on planet Earth are we finding you this afternoon?
Well, this afternoon, I'm in Pensacola, Florida.
Beautiful. And I had the pleasure of visiting you at that facility, and I'm sure we'll get to that in a little bit. Let's start at the very beginning of your timeline then. So tell me where you were born, and tell me a little bit about your family dynamic, what your parents did, how many siblings.
Well, I was born near Norfolk, Virginia. My father was in the Navy, and I have two siblings, a brother and a sister. I went to high school in Rhode Island, and then I went to college and there, and then graduate school at Tulane.
What kind of position did your dad have in the Navy?
He had a variety of interesting positions. He was mostly involved in what is known as the Seabees. And my brother was also a Seabee, and I was also in the Navy, but as an aviator, not as a Seabee.
And the Seabees, if I'm remembering this right, they're the ones that would construct bridges and those kind of things?
Yes, bridges and runways. They're combat construction battalions.
And did he deploy into any kind of combat zones during his time in the military?
Yes, extensively, 3 times in Vietnam, and was there for quite a long while.
I think it's really interesting when people have parents or grandparents in these different conflicts or these different time zones, and how their experience was, how their homecoming was, the transition, and then, how they dealt with that after. The World War II generation, obviously, I think they were received a lot more warmly than, for example, the Vietnam vets. What were some of the things that you heard your father talk about as far as his time over there and then his transition back as well?
Yes, I observed it. He was very young when he had me, and so I was, old enough that I fully could appreciate this kind of reception the veterans received coming back from Vietnam. And in many cases, it was quite rude. Now, not everyone, of course, was like that, but it was certainly not like people receive now, and nothing like World War II reception either. It was in many instances, I would say it was borderline hostile, sometimes more than borderline.
What were the contributing factors that created that hostility that we didn't see, for example, in World War II?
Well, I think in World War II, the nation was quite united in a great effort. And in Vietnam, it was very divided. We're probably equally divided now, but there seems to be less hostility aimed at veterans returning from war now.
That's what I'm seeing too. It's almost like there has been an awakening as to the fact that the young men and women that we send overseas aren't the ones that are making the decisions to go to war in the first place, which seemed to be lost in the conversation back in the 60s and 70s.
Exactly. It's not like a warfighter wants to go to war. Right? That's the person that least wants to go to war.
Yeah, exactly. What about sports and exercise? What were you playing and doing when you were in the school ages?
Well, I was a serious wrestler, and I played other sports, in high school, but I really didn't care about them much. My focus was wrestling, and I come from a long family of wrestlers, a long line of wrestlers in my mother's side of the family. My grandfather was a world champion. We had a lot of elite wrestlers, and so it was natural that I would do that. But that was my passion in high school and college, and a little bit after college too.
What realm was your grandfather a world champion in? Was it the wrestling that we see now in America, or is it more of the Greco-Roman that seemed to precede it?
Well, there are 2 primary amateur. We call it amateur, but actually athletes are paid now. I was not paid. Back in those days, an amateur actually meant you weren't paid. Now we have professional athletes in the Olympics, so it's very different. You mentioned Greco-Roman. That style is relatively unpopular in the United States, and that's because we don't have it in high school or college. So the predominant style of wrestling in the United States is colloquially here in the United States known as freestyle. And it's very, very different than Greco-Roman. So, I was a freestyle wrestler like you see in college or high school.
And was it that same style that your grandfather was a world champion in, or was it a different style?
Yes, it was basically that style. The wrestling world was quite a bit different, obviously, in his era. And there were different federations, and there was some professional wrestling that wasn't fake. Professional wrestling now, the term professional wrestling means something very different.
Absolutely. What about the physical journey? I think some of the most high performing men and women I've had on this show were wrestlers. And when you hear about the intensity of training, about the pain of weight cuts, about the sheer, discomfort of wrestling itself, there was a lot of lessons woven in physically and mentally as far as resilience. What did you experience yourself on that journey?
Oh, that's absolutely true about wrestling. Probably the best modern wrestler, in the last, say, 50 or 100 years, or certainly in the top two, people might argue, but I would say the best was a guy named Dan Gable. And I had a lot of interactions with him, none successfully. And Dan he was quoted maybe 20 years ago in Sports Illustrated saying, after wrestling, nothing seemed very hard. And that might be an exaggeration, but it's certainly difficult physically and mentally. And resilience is the key there, I think. And at the high school level, grit and determination and training and fitness will get you a long ways. Beyond high school, then that's not enough. You need to have an optimized physique for wrestling and some natural talent and, certain gifts. But at the high school level, it's about toughness and grit and desire. But yes, it's a very challenging sport. And, maybe 5 years ago, excuse me for coughing, maybe 5 years ago or something like that, I was elected to the my old high school's Hall of Fame, and I gave it wasn't a wrestling Hall of Fame; it was just general sort of Hall of Fame, and they wanted me to give a talk, and I was supposed to talk about the teacher that had the best and strongest influence on me, and when I thought about it, it was the wrestling coach. So he didn't teach me anything academic, and probably was not capable of that, but the lessons he taught last a whole lifetime, and they don't become obsolete, and they're not trendy, but you never forget them. And so I think you sort of put your finger on it, that it is a unique sport in some ways, and I hope it maintains that uniqueness.
What is your perspective on weight cuts? When I think about when I competed in martial arts, which was not at a high level, usually because of that, we were weighing in on the same day that we fought. So therefore, if I'm 170 pounds and I fight at 170 pounds on that same day, but you see, literally sometimes deadly or near deadly consequences of weight cuts. So an athlete can get to a lower weight division, and it just seems very detrimental. And it seems easily fixed if you did the weigh-in that morning or whatever the solution would be. But obviously wrestling is the kind of one of the more extreme examples of that. So what is your perspective on that now that you're in the human performance side?
Well, I think much harm actually was done to some young people, particularly in high school. High school is where you see some abuses there. Now, it's gotten better over the years. The authorities now are watching it closely after some deaths and other bad outcomes. In my era, they didn't watch very closely. At one point, I was sent to a college in Massachusetts. I think it was Springfield, it was called, where they had this underwater method. They didn't have DEXA scans or anything like that then, but they had a water displacement kind of test where they would put you in this pool and then they would calculate your percentage body fat from that. And it was actually pretty accurate, but, nobody cared too much about that. Later, regulations have come in that have I think, helped to some degree. Actually, I'm of the belief that people's performance actually declined at some point. You would cut so much weight to make a particular weight class that you're robbing yourself of some of your performance. And a lot of times it was done to fit the team structure. So if you think of a wrestling team, and from the coach's perspective, it's a team sport. From my perspective, it wasn't. I wanted to win. But Of course, I wanted the team to win, but the way I could contribute to that happening was for me to win. But sometimes, the coach can look at the lineup and say, well, this fellow can do fine at this weight class, and if I move this other person down a weight class, we'll have two all-stars back to back, rather than two all-stars in one weight class, one basically removing the other from competition. So what happens in these, a lot of times, the two best kids would be in the same weight class, particularly if it was a common weight for a high school student to be able to reach. So you might have, from the coach's point of view, this doesn't make sense. So one of those kids will be, let's say, strongly encouraged to cut a lot of weight and get into even lower weight class.
I witnessed it when I trained MMA in Los Angeles, and I wasn't a fighter. I was a weekend warrior, but punch bag for fighters. And there was a guy, Anthony Johnson, who I only met then. He was kind of on his way up. And he fought at 170 in Colorado one time, and he was a lightweight or heavyweight, depending on, what he normally wanted to fight at. So we're talking a weight cut of, upwards of 50 pounds. And he was already lean, big African-American gentleman. And I don't know what the backstory was, but he ended up getting some sort of, I forget now, virus or cancer when he was, like in his 30s and passing away. But again, what is the damage that we're doing to these athletes by encouraging these weight cuts that's then affecting organs, immune system, etc. when they get older?
Sure. Some degree of metabolic derangement is often seen in ex-wrestlers. And, a lot of people overcome it, but I think it does have an effect. I mean, if you look at, as an adult, high school, you're still developing, but we know each other, James. As an adult, I weigh, and I'm pretty lean, I weigh 183. And I wrestled as an adult at 145.
Wow.
In high school, lower. And so that is an extreme cut. And when you hear people losing 40 pounds, it's not 40 pounds from somebody who's 20% body fat, right? These people are athletes to start with. And so these are intense weight cuts. And I honestly think people have degraded, not intentionally, of course, their performance by cutting so much.
While we're on this subject, we will progress forward, but I think it's fascinating because you're in such an elite human performance environment on the back end now. What is your perspective on performance versus longevity in youth athletes? I've talked about this many times, but I'll abbreviate it. When I came from the UK to America, after a few years, I kept meeting what I call Uncle Ricos, men in their either side of 30s, deconditioned, overweight. And it was always that, well, I woulda, coulda, shoulda been the next, elite star had it not been for my ACL, my MCL, my labrum, etc. And I started wondering, what the hell are we doing to children in this country that, and then as you see this high level of performance and focusing on winning in schools and colleges, I started seeing a trend where, unlike Europe, where we don't train at that high level, but then you see people that graduate school continue to play sports and continue to stay in shape overall. Here you had an extreme level of performance at the detriment of the longevity of the athlete once they progress past. So what is your perspective of the balance between still, of course, trying to win college or high school games, but being mindful of the athlete's wellness and longevity as well?
Yeah, I've had the same experience as you've had. I know a great number of people. I mean, you almost constantly meet people that tell you of their grievous injury that they had in really what should have been a fun and learning experience. And so I do think there's a trade-off there. And looking back at it, it's always difficult. I'm 71 years old now. And looking back, I have a lot of consequence of wrestling, a lot of orthopedic problems. I need both shoulders replaced. I have all kinds of problems like that. It would not have happened without wrestling. On the other hand, I wouldn't be the same person without wrestling. It shaped me, not just physically and not primarily physically, sort of outlook. But there has to be a way to gain the benefit without the lifelong detriment, particularly in something that is not a profession. It's hard to know where the line is. You want the fire, you want the intensity, but somehow I get the impression increasingly, both in high school and college, the focus isn't quite right. And the coaches are pushed very hard, not just to keep their jobs, but to advance to a better program, a bigger school. It's you see this a lot, and I'm not sure how to fix it, but it is an issue.
Absolutely. Well, going back to staying, I guess, in your early life, when you sent me some information on your background, you mentioned living in Guantanamo Bay. Now, obviously, that's an interesting place to live. There's been some recent articles on, the pros and cons of Guantanamo Bay, depending on if you're incarcerated or not. So, what was that like for you? Just living on the outside there, and actually, the nation itself, rather than what it's known for now.
Right. It wasn't the prison. There was a prison there, but it was small at the time. And for a youth, I was young. I was in grade school. I really loved it. It's very large. It's not your typical base. It's big. It has mountains in it. It has lots of ocean. Has some islands. I liked it. Just that it was just super cool place to be a little boy. There was 10 public swimming pools and fabulous. I was already a gym rat. In fact, I got thrown out of them because I was too young. But there were a bunch of real gyms, and gyms back then weren't like today. People say, I'm going to the gym. No, you're not. You're going to some wamby-pamby fitness center with the leotard crowd. These gyms had boxing rings and wrestling mats and, gymnastic equipment. You would never see that now in a public exercise facility. Probably the lawyers would have you if you put, rings in a gym. Somebody would knock their teeth out with the rings by accident, So as a little rugrat type kid, I loved it, and it was full of, it was just full of cool things. All kinds of military exercises. Now, what wasn't cool was partway through my stay, I was there about 4 years. Partway through the stay, we were evacuated for the Cuban Missile Crisis. So that gives you an idea of how long ago it was. And boy, that was not fun. And I became separated from my mother and the other children. And so I ended up completely separate on my own with no money. They put me on a plane to Florida, to Homestead Air Force Base in Florida, and they were on a ship to Virginia. That was an adventure. But it for the most part was a great place. Another thing that was a negative is the schools were pretty bad. At the time, the only school available was the school the Navy operated. And the schools were somewhat segregated depending on the rank of your father. And so I think, several of my teachers, for sure hadn't been to college. And going to college certainly does not make you smart or knowledgeable necessarily. But, there were a different standard in the schools. If you wanted to learn, you could learn. And but that was different for sure.
Going to the gyms quickly, I had Doug Orchard on the show a couple of times now, and he's the filmmaker that made The Motivation Factor that details the La Sierra PE program in the 60s. And it's exactly what you're talking about. It was calisthenics, it was, running, it was running with a partner, pegboards and long parallel bars. And not only did they have an incredibly healthy and fit, group of students, but even things like grades went up, bullying went down because they had to do these in groups and then kind of progress through different, almost like martial arts belts, but they were shorts. And, it was a huge success, but it got dismantled. As we sit
Yes.
here now, 75% of Americans are overweight, of which 44 are obese. And I've had many conversations with people in the military and the first responder professions about the group that we're able to recruit from now is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. What is your perspective, having seen the old school, gym/PE environment, of revisiting that to address this crisis that we have when it comes to fitness and health in America?
I think culturally it's not possible. I mean, I hope I'm wrong, but used to see kids climbing trees. Let me know when you see a kid climbing a tree. If a kid was climbing a tree, people would call the police. It's child endangerment now. Those ropes that went all the way to the ceiling in a big gym, right? They're not going to let you climb up those ropes anymore. It's a very risk-averse sort of helicopter society, and maybe caused by litigation. I'm not sure all the causes, but I don't see it changing, unfortunately, in a good direction.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to. That's the thing. I think, like a lot of things, eventually you get to a crisis point. I mean, recruitment and retention in the fire service, we are there now, and it's finally forcing conversations on healthy work weeks and fitness standards that I'm sure we're going to get into. But, I mean, what's the alternative? It goes to 75%, 80%, 85%. There's got to be a turning point where the common sense in the middle say, yeah, don't put barbed wire in the gyms or pit bulls, but at the same time, you can't wrap children in cotton wool. So kind of like we said with the athletes in high school and college, where is that middle ground where you still forge exercise, you still make it mandatory, you still encourage kids to move, but you don't do 4 days with no access to water.
Yeah, that just reminded me of one of my least favorite aspects of wrestling practice, which I usually loved, but there are these suits that we used to wear, particularly in certain weight classes. We called them slime suits. They were these rubbery, plasticky things, usually blue and horrible. And they had sort of a tight cuff, and they would fill up with perspiration. And the idea was they would crank the heat up, and in these very nasty wrestling rooms, crank the heat up, and you wore these suits and so you're losing weight by dehydration. I mean, think about what a bad way to lose weight in a high-performance environment. So pretty much everyone in the lighter weight classes was constantly dehydrated from these slime suits, and particularly near the match day. And of course, as you noted, the weigh-in was immediately before the match. So you were taking drastic measures to make the weight, which definitely reduced your performance. Back to the gym issue, I think part of the benefit of the robust PE that existed in the 60s and even into the 70s wasn't so much just physical. It was cognitive. It had to do with self-confidence and outlook and perspective, every bit as much as it had to do with muscle. The obesity problem we have today is mostly driven by what people eat. It's activity matters, but what you eat matters the most when it comes to obesity, for sure. And nowadays, how people address the obesity problem is through medication. And in many cases, it seems to be very helpful to them. But it's a shame to think if, I look back at photographs of high school and college, everyone is relatively fit. Now, the athletes are more fit, perhaps, but everyone is thin. Everyone is relatively fit. And it's shocking when you go into a high school to visit a high school now. High school boys used to look like praying mantis. They were so scrawny, but they were wiry and strong. All right, they could do a lot of pull-ups. They've had to take pull-up requirements out of things like jump school in the military, where you learn to parachute. You just hang from the bar now. You don't have to pull yourself up. You just have to be able to hang. Well, that's led to a lot of injuries. 25 to 35% of the people in jump school receive a brain injury. That's way more than there used to be, and it's largely, in my view, due to lack of fitness.
This is what worries me about the GLP-1 conversation. I think it is absolutely great if there is a tool that can get someone back down to a more manageable weight if there's a conversation from day one on the exit strategy. And on the way there, you're building in, dietary habits and exercise habits and improving sleep, etc. But by sheer starvation through chemicals, you're not improving the cardiovascular system. You're not adding more micronutrients to the body. So I think and then like so many other areas of medicine, I'm using air quotes now, our doctors don't tell someone, that's on a hypertensive med, oh, let's put you on this just until we can get your blood pressure down. Okay, we're going to change the way you eat, we're going to change the way you move, we're going to look at if your insurance has gym membership, etc. It's just you're going to be on this forever. It's the same with the psychiatric meds. So this is what worries me is that, you might have a lower body composition, but that doesn't mean that you've got a healthier society.
Well, no, because the assumption is you won't change. So when you go on a GLP-1, they don't tell you to change your diet. Nutrition is a subject about which most physicians know very little. And so they say, well, take the GLP-1 and you'll lose weight. And you typically do lose weight, and it's a good thing. But I agree with you. I have colleagues, I know people well, that they see GLP-1 as the rest of their life. In other words, they're not using it to make a change and then get off it and change how they eat. The reason they're in the condition they're in is what they eat. And so now they can still eat all the stuff they shouldn't eat, but they have their GLP-1. So I'm not against them. And there's a lot of research showing a lot of benefit in a lot of people. But the idea that you would just have this drug for the rest of your life rather than shift your eating pattern or your exercise pattern or both seems actually ridiculous to me.
Yeah. Well, let's go to your career path then, because you've had so many incredible positions that you've held. When you were in high school, were you dreaming of the Navy? And if not, walk me through what came first and then how you found yourself enlisting.
It was the furthest thing from my my mind. I saw my dad's career, and I saw the good and the bad, and I really wasn't interested in doing that. In high school, I was really mostly interested. I had academic interests, but my primary interest was wrestling. And after high school, and most of the way through college. During college, without a plan, it was sort of pushed on me. I was in the music business in a very small way at first. I was a singer in a band, and I wasn't that successful. Didn't really care that much about it. It was just for fun, and there was a controversy about the terrible entertainment being offered. Remember, this is a long time ago. This is in the early 70s, if you can imagine what college was like then. And the students were all chanting outside the president's house about the terrible entertainment and the foolish way their entertainment money was spent, the student activity funds. And so he said, okay, well, pick a student to fix this. And without me wanting this job, everybody said, okay, the only one that knows anything about this is probably Ken among the students. So I got sort of elected to be in charge of the entertainment. And I took it seriously, and it was very successful. And we started, the college started making a lot of money, and the students were happy. And, these universities are not designed to make money on student entertainment. And this was not warmly received in some circles, particularly in the professional promoting circles. So the professional promoters in that area saw it as unfair competition. And that, we were able to pay less for the same bands because you had the full faith and credit of the state. And rock and roll promoters are not necessarily always very reliable. And we had better terms and we didn't have to pay for the facilities. So clearly it was, in a sense, unfair competition, right? And through that process, I became friends with a very successful promoter. And he said, rather than be angry at you like the other promoters, I would like to partner. And so we did that, first through the university and then privately afterward. And so I was a rock and roll promoter, and I did that for a while. And in that business, it's one where you might develop some less than desirable personal habits. And there's a lot of unseemly characters in that business. Not my colleague. He was wonderful and still a very close friend. And I decided, I'm heading down a bad path here in terms of substance abuse and other things. And I was getting married, and I thought, this is no life for her. And it's back then it was much different than now. Now if you're a major rock band, you travel with personal trainers and, physicians, and you have dietitians doing your, it wasn't like that then, right? It was a bunch of guys that typically were pretty wasted most of the time. And I thought, well, what would get this straightened out pretty quickly is military service. And my whole family, on one side had been in the service. So it was funny. I drove to the recruiter in a Jaguar convertible. This is back in the days of the XKE. And I had long hair. I was in the music business. I could see him looking at me out the window when I parked right in front of his very humble little outpost in a strip mall. And I go in, and I had my future wife with me, and I go in and say, I think I'd like to explore joining the Navy. His name was Chief Petty Officer Peoples. He was an African-American guy. We became lifelong friends until he passed. He looks at me and said, "You're not joining this man's Navy." He was very unimpressed. He wanted me out of there as fast as possible. And but I sort of insisted that I at least wanted to take the tests, And of course, they had this test like, do you drink alcohol? Have you ever done X, Y? I just said, check them all, And I did his test, and it takes a few hours. And, he said, don't call us, we won't call you. That was his attitude, right? Go away. And so I did go away. And a few weeks later, he calls me and he says, look, against my own recommendation, my supervisor says you should come in and he wants to talk to you. And it basically said you have very high aptitude in mathematics, and we want to build in computing. And in the future, computers will be important to the military. They weren't using them then for anything except like data processing kinds of things. And I thought, computers, I'd rather be beaten than do computers. Back then, computers, these were like the guys with the light blue polyester stretch pants, and the pocket liner with 12 pens in them. and they worked behind a window. It was like it was like these data processing dudes. And I didn't want to do that. And they were explaining to me, no, this would be a new thing, and you get to go to 2 years more school. You like school, don't you? We'll pay for it. I'm like, whoa, I do like school. And you'll pay for it. And they said, and you'll be flying. Do you like to fly? And I said, oh yeah, I like to fly. And so I ended up in the Navy, and to be in that program, I had to agree to 6 years instead of 4 years. I knew I didn't want to have a career. I just wanted to contribute, and I wanted to pee in the bottle a lot. And so I got my wish. So I had many, quote, random urination tests.
Now, you say that just because it made you stay on the straight and narrow?
Sure.
Okay.
It did.
Gotcha.
And that was my primary goal. And also I wanted to contribute, and I wanted to get out of the music business in a way that was clean break. It's hard to explain, but that's not an easy business at a high level to leave cleanly. So my partner had a beautiful long career, and he did very well. He's a Hall of Fame promoter, but and we're still close friends, and we talk a lot and chuckle about our different career paths.
You mentioned that computers weren't really being used that much. What did you see as far as the evolution of the use of computers in your time in the Navy specifically?
Well, it was massive, and it's continued, as you know. What was happening then was computers were becoming more used tactically. As I said, they were used heavily already for things like payroll processing. These were big mainframe computers using punch cards. If you haven't ever used punch cards, I'll say you just never lived. I mean, they're truly dreadful. But I didn't want to do that, and they convinced me I wouldn't be, and I wasn't. What I was involved in is anti-submarine warfare. So submarines in the Cold War were one of the biggest issues, and both sides. And the Soviet Union had a great number of submarines, some pretty sophisticated and some not. But even the ones that weren't on paper sophisticated were troublesome. And the diesel submarines, for one hand, were quite troublesome. They would come up at night and charge their batteries and then go down during the day, and they're running on a battery. So they were relatively quiet, but they would use them, not as quiet as the best subs, but they would use them in the Mediterranean heavily. And the Mediterranean is so acoustically noisy that it's a good place to hide. And what was happening is the airborne assets that looked for submarines in the time, used a wide suite of different kinds of sensors as they do now. But the processing, we're talking about the computing aspects, were largely analog. And some of I want you to visualize many boxes, big black boxes full of spinning gears. They look inside a Rolex, but scale it up to 100 pounds. And so we were using basically mostly analog computers in those days. And they were wonderful in one regard, in that they were quite resistant to electromagnetic pulse. So if nukes are going off in the Med or anywhere really, and you're near, modern electronics is vulnerable to that. However, these gear-driven things were ridiculous, and the boxes, like I said, were like 80 to 100 pounds full of spinning gears. And what really changed things was the realization we could not succeed in doing a good job in ASW with that technology. It had to go digital, and primarily because we wanted to use fast Fourier transform mathematics to pull the signal of the prop of the submarine out of the background noise in the ocean. And that's why they brought me in the Navy, even though my scruffy appearance. So what they were interested in is, the ocean is exceptionally noisy, and you've got ships all over the place, particularly in the Mediterranean. It's small. And pulling the cavitation of the prop out is what you want to be able to do. And you want to be able to know not just that's a prop there, but if you get enough information, you know what class of submarine it is and actually which hull it is. And this is very important tactically when you're prosecuting the submarine. And so in my era, it basically shifted into modern digital systems and microprocessors. The systems on the aircraft that were digital were not microprocessors. And so that's kind of the group that came in with me, was sort of doing that transition.
You're seeing the beginning of an arc as you're getting into this digital world. Back then, if you can remember, what were the predictions that you had of where you thought this technology was going to take us that were correct? And then what were any that you kind of forecasted that were actually wrong?
Oh, wow. What a great question. Many of my forecasts were no doubt wrong. And one tends to remember when they're right more than when they're wrong. I think it's a human trait. Maybe it's a defense mechanism. while I was in the Navy, I was studying a chip called 6502. That was the kind of chip it was. And these guys on the Navy base, there was a computer club called the Homebrew Computer Club. And two of the guys in the club, and this was a club for full-up nerds, and I would say less than half the club were actually in the service. Maybe a third of the club were in the military, because it was in Silicon Valley at the Navy base there in Moffett Field. Now NASA has the whole base, and I later worked there for NASA. But when I was there then, it was half NASA and half Navy. And this club would meet there, and it had all kinds of interesting young people in it. And two of the guys in the club were also working with the 6502 chip, and the Navy was interested, and that's why I was looking at it. And they started in their home, in one of their homes, Apple Computer. And so the early Apple products were 6502 chip-driven products. And my predictions were wrong, right? I didn't expect it to become a huge company. I had no idea about iPhones or anything. But what was right was I thought this is the future. I don't mean Apple per se was the future. I meant microprocessor-driven home computers were going to be huge. And at the time, you had to make them yourself, and you make a little wooden box for it. And, they were very hokey compared to even to the Apple II. The original, super original ones you had to make yourself were very hokey. But it was a window into the future. And we had these video games like that you would play on them that were simple. And you would load the data from a cassette player. And this was really tricky business because sometimes it didn't load right. It made all these ridiculous sounds, and you had a cassette tape with your data on it, and you would load it through the port into the computer. And there were things like very simple versions of Dungeons and Dragons and stuff like that. It was an interesting time, but where I really did see the future to some extent, though nowhere, not really accurately, but somewhat, was, in college, I had been a philosophy major, and I specialized in logic and mathematical philosophy and philosophy of the mind. How does an organ, like a brain or a liver or any other organ, how can an organ give rise to something like a mind? And there, the shelves were bare. There was nothing in the philosophy literature that was even reasonable. It was things like that. It was full of analogies. Well, it's like a clock. It's not really like a clock, And when I came across computers in the Navy, I realized, this is what I had wanted to do all along. And now it's not going to be considered philosophy of mind. It's going to be called computer science. And I need to get out of the Navy as quickly as possible when my 6 years are up and get a Ph.D. in computer science, because I still wanted to do the same thing, was to explore the relationship between a physical substrate like silicon, or in my head, wetware, and the emergent property that you would call a mind, or in the computer would be an executing program. And I want to understand that relationship and study it. And so that turned out to be a pretty good look into the future. And that's how I became interested in AI back then in the 70s.
So talk to me about that, because a lot of people that have come on here that have had a background that understand that world, firstly, they've said that AI is a very general term or a misused term. But with the AI side specifically, this beginning of, computers, as you mentioned, in wooden boxes to where we are today, what are the things that excite you about this technology as it continues to evolve and improve? And then what, if any, are the areas that scare you about this technology?
Oh, sure. I mean, the scariest thing in the world are humans. I mean, there's no question about that. When people tell me they're afraid of AI, what they really mean is they're afraid of people and how people will use it. And as you mentioned, it's an incredibly broad field. And yet, these days, the term AI, for me, has become an annoyance. It in the public's eyes, and even worse in the eyes of politicians, um, their entire understanding of AI has to do with them playing with chatbots. And, chatbots are one little tiny piece of AI, but it's captured 99% of the public attention and the media attention because it's something that humans relate to. Humans like to think it's sentient, or they like to think it's talking to them. They say please to it. If you're angry at the company that made the AI you're using, always say please, because it costs them a lot of money to process please.
Good to know.
It doesn't know what please means. It doesn't. It's not. There's no understanding of these. These are squiggles to it. So when you type the squiggles that we regard as comprising the word please, it's kind of like if it was Chinese characters to me, and I had to process them by looking up in a book and then matching those characters to other characters. But in the computer, it can do it blazingly quickly. But it's saying please to it is of no help. But it does cost it resources to have to process it. So from my point of view, a good way to think of AI and a better way to think of good AI would be human-centered AI aimed to extend and leverage human cognition. I could think of it more as amplified intelligence as opposed to artificial intelligence. We used to call heavier than air flight. At the time of the Wright brothers, a lot of people were calling it AF, artificial flight. And they thought it was not really flying. It was like a simulation of flight. Birds fly, but this isn't really flying, is it? And I see AI in sort of the same way. I'm interested in amplifying the cognitive abilities of humans, whether it's humans and machines working as a team or as a cognitive orthotic. I have eyeglasses on, and they're an ocular orthoses, right? They're not a model of my eye. They wouldn't pass a Turing test for being an eye, but they certainly do make me a better human. And I'm interested in AI systems that work like that are essentially cognitive amplifiers. I don't want a cognitive prosthetic. I have a brain. I want to use it and continue to use it. But a cognitive orthotic, that's pretty cool.
I see the conversation with robotics kind of paralleling what you're talking about. Since, the Industrial Revolution, humans were put in factories. I've highlighted many times recently, children were put in factories because they need these human beings to move these things around. And you see this all over the world. What excites me about this technology, whether it's the robotics and the automation, or whether it's on the more computer-based side, is that unlike how it's presented to some, well, this can write your book and this can paint your picture and all the things that are supposed to be human expressions of emotion and art, etc., where I don't think AI is the solution. That's where humans need to be creative. That's what's good for us as a species. But to be able to take over the things that we relied on humans to do. So, for example, to minimize the amount of humans on planet Earth that are working through the night when they should be in bed sleeping and resting, and allowing these machines to do the things that they used to do with a human being that they can now automate. So it kind of, it seems like it parallels what you were talking about. I think some of this technology is very exciting because it can actually return a lot of human beings back to the way we're naturally supposed to live, which is to wake up with the rising sun, work, love, play during the day, and then sleep at night, not, stand in a 7-Eleven manning the till for 10 hours.
I agree. And that's kind of what I mean by human-centered approach. It's important that we keep humanity at the center of the conversation and understand that the reason we develop technology is to benefit the human. There's no other reason to develop technology. And this often gets lost. I mean, it sounds shockingly obvious when I say it. You shouldn't even have to say it. but somehow it's sort of lost in the noise. And just because we can do something doesn't mean we should do it. Like, where I work is a world-class robot lab, one of the best in the world, humanoid robots. I'm sure we could easily make a wife-kissing robot, but that's my job. I mean, why would I do that? I would rather have the robots do jobs that are dangerous, dirty, dumb, tedious, and free humans up to do other kinds of work. And so I think that is what will likely happen unless we make very bad choices.
Absolutely. Well, you mentioned about leaving the military, studying computer science. How did that then take you back into the world of NASA?
Well, what happened there was I hadn't mentioned it, but I'd always had a strong interest in space. And I guess probably a lot of people did in my era, particularly with Apollo and all the excitement of that, right? And I wasn't so much, a lot of people grew up wanting to be astronauts, and it really wasn't me. I was interested in the sort of mission side of it, the technology, how is this even possible, that side of it. And I thought, well, I'll never live any of that. It's just something I'm interested in. And after the Navy, I became a professor, and I was doing research, and several times I was doing mostly research for the Department of Defense, but also related to medical AI, early applications of AI in medicine. And several times people at NASA got a hold of me and said, hey, could you explain something to us, or how does this work, or we're interested in using this technology. And I became friendly with a lot of them. And over time then started to serve on various committees. And in the 90s, I had mentioned the homebrew computer club that was at Moffett Field, but remember the discussion of the 6502 chip. And in the late 90s, the NASA administrator called me and said, would you consider taking a break, a leave from IHMC? I know you won't quit. Just take a leave for a couple of years and go out to Moffett Field, where NASA has its more basic research place. It's where, it's kind of like the University of NASA. It's mostly PhDs, and it also smells like a university at times, if you know what I mean. But they had me, and I said, I'll think about it. And after a while, I thought, I'll do that. So Admiral Wright was left here to be the leader at IHMC, along with a guy named Alberto Cañas. And I went to NASA Ames as the assistant center director, and also as the head of research. And I was out there for a while and really got heavily into the application of new technology in space exploration, mostly robotic space exploration, but also some human work. And then later I became much later, I came back to IHMC, and the last half of Bush administration and the first half of Obama, so this is quite a bit later, I was on the NASA Advisory Council, and for most of that time I was the chairman after Harrison Schmitt retired from the council. Harrison was Apollo 17 astronaut and a wonderful guy, and he's still alive. He's the only scientist to ever go to the moon. So on his mission, we learned more than probably all the other Apollo missions combined in terms of the science part.
Let's talk about that then, because as the Artemis lunar mission just concluded a few days ago, there has been a lot of conversation on, did we go to the moon? Did we not go to the moon? But it's interesting because people have asked me that, and then, not that James Gearing's opinion has any value whatsoever, but to me, it's like, well, in my world, it doesn't matter. It's like Schroeder's cat. We either did or we didn't. It doesn't have any impact on me at the moment in my day-to-day life and the mission that I'm trying to do. And the one thing, because I always believe that, yes, of course we went to the moon. The only thing that my sister said to me once is, if we went to the moon back then, why haven't we been back since? That didn't suddenly turn my my belief round in a circle. But I'm like, okay, well, that's a good question to get answered as well. So having
Sure.
you on the show, working with people that literally were on these missions, talk to me firstly about the original moon landings and your perspective, and what are the answers to some of the most frequent denier statements?
Yeah. It's hard to take these folks seriously. And I think it's a product of the modern education system and also social media. But the I don't want to spend much time on that because it's ridiculous. The but talking about the moon generally is something that's wonderful to talk about. We can't keep secrets about anything, even top secret military stuff. These blabbermouths leak all over the place. Apollo had tens of thousands of people working on it. We had a adversary, if not enemy country, racing us to the moon that had absolute visibility on the mission. Right? The moon is close. They knew when we landed on the moon. If we hadn't landed, they would have mentioned it. It largely ended their dreams of dominance. It was a crushing blow and a very strong source of what's known as soft power. And of course, the argument goes the opposite from the way you mentioned it. The argument that you said was, well, if we did go, why didn't we go back? And I'll come back to why we didn't go back. And it's not a pretty story. But if we didn't go, why don't we just keep not going? In other words, if it was fabricated on a Hollywood set or something, you would just keep doing it. In fact, you wouldn't have to go back to the moon. You could do Mars also without going there. I mean, the thing, it's ridiculous, right? You would be caught instantly if you were fabricating it. And you hear all kinds of things like, why wasn't the flag looks like it was waving, or, there's no wind on the moon, just silly stuff that's easily debunked. But the more important question that you raised was, or your sister raised, or someone raised, was, why did we not go back? Well, human spaceflight is uniquely problematic politically. So when John F. Kennedy said we're going to go to the moon by the end of this decade, that required the country to go all in. And I do mean all in, right? And so NASA went from a largely unknown agency called NACA and became very quickly 4% of federal spending. 4%. So right now it's 0.3%. And it was basically all hands on deck. So the most talented people in engineering in the country all wanted to work at NASA at the time. It's not the case now, right? And there was tremendous focus. Once it was completed, and Apollo 17 was the last mission, President Nixon canceled it. And this started a long legacy of presidents destroying what the previous president had invested in. Human spaceflight has become the football of presidents. And they basically leave the rest of the agency alone. So, NASA's got all kinds of things, right? It does robotic missions and, aeronautical missions and earth science missions. It's a big organization. Human spaceflight is just one piece of it, but that's the piece they monkey with. And as I explained this to the Congress when I was the board chairman. I was giving testimony, and by then I was annoyed. And it's still the same situation. And I said, look, metaphorically, it's like if the president and the nation as a whole decides we want to grow carrots, and we plant carrots, and we spend billions of dollars planting carrots. And by God, these will be good carrots. Then a new president comes and says, my predecessor's plan was carrots, but that's his legacy. I want my legacy. I want rutabagas. We're going to plant rutabagas. And before you get any carrots or rutabagas, because human spaceflight is multi-decadal in its duration to get anything done. You just keep digging up everything the previous guy wanted to do. So literally almost every presidential transition has canceled what the previous guy wanted to do. So we get nowhere, and we spend billions of dollars doing nothing, and most of the effort is spent on PowerPoint, and no metal gets spent. Under the Constellation program, when Mike Griffin was the administrator at NASA, it looked like it was really going to happen, and metal was being bent, rockets were being designed and built, and then new president comes and is canceled. What NASA was able to salvage from the Constellation program is what you just saw on Artemis 2. So they were able to salvage most of the SLS design, a slightly degraded version from what was in Constellation, and most of what was happening with Orion, the capsule, the human element. And so you just saw them exercised. But going forward in the Artemis Lunar program, those components will continue to play an important role, but they're not where the risk to the program is, because they're pretty mature technologies. When in Constellation, the idea was to not use anything that required new inventions. In other words, if you're going to do something soon, you don't say, well, we'll wait till we invent something new. And so Constellation was moving pretty quickly. But in general, we just make PowerPoint.
What about Mars? Why should we get to Mars, and how soon do you think it will happen?
Well, all of the schedules you hear from the government on are about human spaceflight are nonsense, because, as I said, we start over every 4 to 8 years. Currently we're talking about humans on the moon in 2028. Zero chance of that. Zero. I mean, literally zero. Not a small chance, zero chance. We don't even have a lander. So SpaceX and also Blue Origins are trying to make landers. We don't have a workable lander. And the lander designs they do have are more or less ridiculous. The SpaceX lander is based on Starship. And you say, well, why would they design a ridiculous lander? It's a ridiculous lander for landing on the moon, because it's not designed to land on the moon. It's designed for Mars. And you mentioned Mars. Landing on the moon with this thing is ridiculous. It's 50 meters tall. You have to have an elevator for the humans to get down from it. It makes zero sense for all kinds of reasons, and requires 15 or 20 refueling operations in flight. So you have to launch 15 or 20 launches for one mission. We did the moon with one launch in Apollo. But if your goal is to come up with some system that would be possibly useful for Mars, and then sort of force fit it to the moon, that's kind of what we're doing. And I don't think it'll work, and I don't think we'll actually do it. There'll be a new administration, and they will kill it just like all the other ones have been killed in the past. This one may be for good reasons. Now, I am, of all people, would be thrilled if it did work, right? And we did it and it worked. But it's a very awkward way to explore the moon. China, on the other hand, has a very sensible approach, very simple, straightforward, because their goal is the moon. We have this attitude like, well, we've already been to the moon, so let's just use the moon as a stepping stone to Mars. But Mars and the moon couldn't be more different. What systems and hardware make sense for one make little sense for the other. So you asked primarily about Mars. Mars will not happen in my lifetime, or your lifetime, or your children's lifetime. People say, Elon Musk, I think, just announced, he's going to go to Mars. I guess personally, I don't know, in 2029. That's not happening. We don't know how to land on Mars. We have some ideas. When the rovers that we land there have very complex landing, and we would never do that with humans. It wouldn't scale to our methods we use now don't scale to the size of a human lander. And the reason that Mars is so difficult is these missions would be 500 to 1,000 days long, depending on how you organize the mission. You would be thoroughly radiated. You'd in 1,000 days with no gravity, your body would be falling apart. You wouldn't have a little gym in it like you do in space station. This is going to be a small vehicle screaming across the solar system to Mars. The human element would just be crushed. You look out the window, you're not going to be looking at like pretty blue ball of Earth. When you look out the window, you'd see nothing, just black for a very long time. And then when you get to Mars, I'm not sure you could be fit enough to don your suit. And then when you get to Mars, Mars has atmosphere, unlike the moon. I mean, God gave us the moon. We should go there first and do it well. But the Mars atmosphere is just thick enough to burn you up. So coming into Mars, you need a heat shield, an effective one. But it's not thick enough to slow you down much. So the Earth has a very thick atmosphere, which slows us down. That's how we slow down coming into Earth, is the atmosphere, among other ways. Mars is just right on the balance point. It's enough atmosphere to be very problematic, not enough to help with deceleration a lot. You have to bring so much fuel to Mars to get out of the Martian gravity well that you end up with big logistics problems. So a Mars mission we're far, 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 far from ready to do a Mars mission. Unless we're willing to do a one-way mission, which many people would accept, but the government will never do a one-way mission. Or maybe a mission to Phobos. I used to advocate for that. Phobos is one of the moons of Mars. It's tiny, so it has almost no gravity, so you don't have the gravity well problem. There's no atmosphere, so you don't have the atmosphere problem. So it'd be much, much easier, but the Mars would fill the whole view. If you were standing on Phobos, just Mars would just be looming there, red and big and beautiful, and it would be very motivating, I think, for humanity to do it. But Mars is a very difficult human mission. Unclear that it's actually in the near term doable safely.
I like the idea of a one-way flight. You could pick certain politicians and send them off.
Yeah, I have a few in mind. I actually when I was giving a talk once with to the astronauts, and several said, "Sign me up for that, dude." The people that didn't have like kids and stuff, were like, yeah. What would be a more a sort of more important, well-spent human life, right? So, you could live there quite a while, and you could bring enough stuff if you survived the landing, and you would perish, of course. Eventually you'd have no food, you'd have no supplies, you'd have no, you would perish. But culturally, we insist on bringing them back, and I think that's to our credit, actually. But I do kind of like Phobos. I just don't think it'll happen either.
Well, you mentioned IHMC. I want to get to that, but just before we do, because I'm almost certain it was you that really opened my eyes, or maybe it was one of my NSW guests before that, but very few people have heard of DARPA. And I think that the philosophy behind that, the innovation that's created that does move people forward in wherever they are, whether they're a computer scientist or a firefighter, I think has a lot of value to the first responder professions, because a lot of us are stuck in the dark ages in some of the ways that we think. So what was the kind of metamorphosis of DARPA? And just talk to me about what they do, obviously in a general form in 2026.
Sure. DARPA is an acronym for Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. And they're sort of the Department of Defense's research long ball hitters. So in defense, each service has an extensive research organization. In the Air Force, it's Air Force Research Labs. In the Navy, it's Office of Naval Research and the Naval Research Lab. Army is Army Research Lab. And these are in-house, in-service research facilities. DARPA has a different job. So DARPA itself doesn't conduct the research. DARPA funds the research that's conducted and guides it strongly, and they don't throw the money over the fence like some government research agencies. they're very engaged in the work and very much checking constantly for progress. When I say they're the long ball hitters, I mean, in baseball, somebody who swings for the fences all the time strikes out a lot, and so does DARPA. But you also hit a lot of home runs. So that's the role of DARPA. The DARPA role in the defense research ecosystem is to fund things that are possible, maybe, right on the edge, but if they work, would change everything. So they're not supposed to be focusing on incremental things, that are relatively obvious that it would work. And that should go to a different agency to fund, but it should be things that are big game changers or sort of out of the box kind of things. And, I've some DARPA program managers like to say, I didn't fund that because to do that project, for it to succeed, would have required 2 miracles. And I only fund 1 miracle at a time. In other words, they know that not everything they do is going to be successful, but even most of the unsuccessful DARPA projects have pushed what's possible so hard that there were discoveries and scientific discoveries and learnings, even if the application that they had in mind turned out to not be feasible, which often happens. But often, when you think about things like the internet or GPS or all kinds of things, DARPA played a huge role in all of those things and many other things that, you wouldn't know about. And we have several former DARPA program managers here at IHMC, and DARPA is our largest sponsor, but it's an interesting organization.
When you compare the philosophy behind what you just described and it's contrasted with, let's just take the fire service, because you and I both obviously had some interaction with that a couple of years ago. What are you seeing as far as any disconnects between innovation or open-minded thinking in the DARPA world and the research projects that they're sponsoring, and, for example, my profession and what you're seeing locally here? Not picking on any specific agency, but just the profession in general.
No, I understand it, and it's very different than most organizations. It's very different than NASA, for example. In NASA, you have these large performer organization where you have branches and divisions and directorates, and they're all organized around, and they have a permanence, and you sort of work your way up through the system. The way it works at DARPA is everyone is temporary. You don't get to build a little kingdom. If you're able to convince the DARPA director that your ideas have merit, and some other key people as well, they have merit, they bring you into the fold, and you have a large budget at your discretion, a large degree of discretion, and you have only a few years to make a big difference. So your hair's on fire, and you're working long hours, and you brook no nonsense, and you want to push as hard as you can, and you're going to be gone in 4 years, 2 years, whatever. You won't be there long. So people that come to DARPA are typically coming on temporary assignment, either from academia or from industry, and from any walk of life, really, if you've got the skill sets and you have the ideas. So there's nothing else really like it in government in particular. Once something is successful, it has many claimants and many children. So other agencies in the government have tried to create their own DARPAs. Like there's one called ARPA-H, which is supposed to be like the health, H meaning the health version of DARPA. But it's not really like DARPA yet. Maybe it will morph into something. They're trying to be like that, to take big risks. But, a lot of it has to do with culture and legacy, and it's hard to make a change on a dime. It's about the furthest. DARPA way of working is very, very far from how, say, most any organizations in the fire service or NASA or 99% of the Department of Defense work.
Talk to me about IHMC then. What was the kind of genesis story of that? And then what are you looking at in 2026 again? What are the areas that you're focused on?
Well, IHMC is largely about developing science and technology to extend human capabilities. For example, cognition, perception, locomotion, resilience. These are the kind of things that we like to work on. And organizationally, IHMC is a not-for-profit research lab of the Florida University system. So inside the university system of Florida, there are 12 universities and 2 large institutes. The other one is the Moffitt Cancer Center in Tampa. And so there are 14 units. And IHMC and Moffitt are the 2 institutes. IHMC's way of working is project-based, so we don't have branches or divisions or departments. We work as sort of horizontally pulling together the people we need to win a competition to do the work we want to do. So we look for opportunities, solicitations, and then we respond to them by pulling a team from across the IHMC that has the right skill sets to address the problem. And we often partner with other organizations to address the problem. About a third of us work in human performance and resilience kind of work, health span, resilience, and performance. About a third in AI-related fields, and about a third in robotics and exoskeletons.
When we had our pre-meeting before I joined you on the Blue Sky for the first responder mental health crisis here locally, it was interesting because you'd asked, one of the officers in the room as well, what do you do for human performance? And they detailed a non-punitive annual fitness test. And I remember you saying that's not human performance. And again, this is not to judge. It's just simply, it really illustrated, I think this really kind of hit me in that room 2.5 years ago, whatever it was. This is the problem. In the fire service, when we're even talking about the work week, when we're talking about decontamination, whatever it is, fitness standards, the conversation isn't to forge performance. It's, well, they keep dying. Why do they keep dying? Let's try and fix them. Let's try and stop them dying as much, which is a Grand Canyon-sized chasm from forging human performance. So I know you understand a little bit about, the shifts and then the mandatory overtime and the hours that these men and women are working. From your, very experienced lens, talk to me from a human performance side on the importance of sleep on cognition, ability, and even, down the other side of that. I think the Challenger was one of the incidents that was related to sleep deprivation with all those deaths as well. So what is the dark side of lack of performance too?
Well, sure. And at the meeting that you're discussing, there were several real opportunities that were identified, and you hit on one right there. Scheduling as it relates to sleep, I think, is a huge issue for the fire service, and some fire service organizations seem to be addressing it to some extent, and others not. But as you probably recall, work scheduling was really discussed a lot, and looking to interconnect the goals of firefighting, resilience, and health. It would also improve recruiting and retention if you could do something about a more rational schedule, and also reducing mandatory overtime. And there was a lot of talk about even moving to a 24/72 schedule, which I think you could explain to your listeners very well, in my opinion. But we had a lot of reports, a lot of recommendations, lots of assessment tools could be done, a lot of testing, a lot of enhancement of performance. I think the fire service ought to treat themselves. You might recall we had the former psychologist there from the Army Special Mission Unit that was just in Venezuela.
Yes.
All right. And remember what he talked about. So he talked a lot about the importance of esprit de corps and of building character and pride in the unit and being special in a way. And that organization is exceptionally good at it. And he was a valuable contributor. And I hope people took away some of what he said and listened to it. He talked about how this would affect resilience and recruiting and retention. And he really pushed the idea of a conscious effort to elevate the esprit de corps and pride in the organizations. And he talked about all the little things that leadership can do to enhance that. But there were many solid recommendations that came out of that meeting.
From a human performance side, whether this is astronauts or naval special warfare, all these groups that you've worked with, talk to me about the importance of sleep when it comes to operating at a high level, being able to make those, life or death decisions at a moment's notice.
It's close to everything. I mean, if you don't, it's one of those points of failure that you really can't work around it. We've done research on how to enhance human performance in degraded sleep environments and how to be able to perform high with less sleep. So far, really, you just need your sleep. There's things you can do to make it better, but it's really, really important. And the decision-making errors are often attributed to lack of sleep. And you see it. I mean, you heard about, everyone's heard without talking about any details of errors in judgment that were occasionally made by very highly trained, very capable aviators, for example, in Afghanistan, and certainly not meaning to hit the wrong target, right? But they had been up for a very long time. They had refueled a bunch of times to get there. It's tough. And sleep is everything. And with the focus now on Asia and the South China Sea heating up, there's much more focus in defense research on how to do something about sleep, whether there are ways to have better performance with less sleep, which I'm not too optimistic about, or I'm willing to research it, but I'm just naturally not too optimistic that we'll find something that really has all the real benefits of profound sleep. And we all know this in our daily life, but when you're in a high stress, all the cards are on the table kind of environment, and your sleep is bad, you're asking for trouble. You're just absolutely asking for trouble.
What about from the physical side? I love the term tactical athlete, and I think that, we kind of downplay what we're expected to do. And obviously, depending on where you work, I've worked, for example, the last place next to a 30-story hotel. So that would require 100 pounds of gear, ascending 30 flights of stairs before you even go to work and fight fire and pull someone out and drag them all the way down. So absolutely, we are athletes. What are some of the innovations that you've seen in the physical performance side that you're excited about?
Well, we do a lot of work in that area here, both for high-performing organizations when we're young, relatively young, but also to be high-performing physically as we're old. And I think that's actually the bigger challenge, and in some ways the more interesting. And you see this in the more the very most special military organizations. Their average age is much higher than the average age in the military in general. And understanding how to maintain extreme high performance throughout the entire lifespan, I think, is really the goal. When we're young, we're sort of professional learners, and we're going through rapid development, and then we sort of have a peak period, and then there's this long period of decline, and there's sort of a curve. You can map a curve of human health span, which really is measured in terms of performance in many ways. And what we want to do is drag that curve a little to the right and compress the years of morbidity, so that one's life would go happy, 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 dead, not happy, not so happy, really unhappy, can't do anything, in the nursing home, then dead. And I think a lot of the crosstalk between high performance in youth, like athletic performance, and what's been learned there in terms of muscle, in terms of metabolism, in terms of mitochondria, is also now really playing out in the aging population. And so there's a lot of research on muscle in older people and the avoidance of sarcopenia. Sarcopenia is one of the main reasons why people end up losing their freedom. You end up in a facility because you can't get off the toilet, or you can't get off the floor if you're on the floor. The loss of muscle is devastating. It's usually tied with other things, loss of bone and other things. And it's to some degree avoidable, but there's a great crosstalk between what's learned in terms of high-end athletics and the aging population, even though you might think there's no connection, but there is, of course.
Well, this ties back to the youth athlete again. When you have an environment where you break your children and then, they don't want to play sports anymore. Because I remember even in sports science years ago in the University of North London, learning about osteoporosis. And one interesting example was when they studied bone density of elite cyclists, the only place they actually had dense bones was at the wrist when they were leaning on the handlebars. And so they were saying, look, it's not calcium, it's not milk, it's resistance exercise. But people aren't getting that messaging. They're getting the little milk mustache and saying, well, if you just drink milk while you watch commercials, then your bones will get strong. And I think this is what's interesting in the fire service is a lot of the chronic physical and mental health diseases could be addressed if we just reframed performance. Because,
totally agree.
For example, my profession totally fights fitness standards. And when you go to a fire academy in Florida, it's called minimum standards. Like it's saying, this is the shittest you should ever be your entire life. So, don't ever stop training. And if you think about elite mental performance and you listen to, the tier one operators, they're doing the meditation and the breath work and counseling because they want to get into the flow state when they're in a gunfight. And it's the same with us. Those same tools will help us, pull us away from depression, anxiety, suicide ideation, addiction. So when you frame it with performance, not again, backbreaking elite performance, but a strong level of performance, that pulls the longevity piece along with it.
It does. And it pulls the health span piece along with it even more than the longevity piece. I like walking over to the Health Span Resilience and Performance Research Complex here. I'm in a different building. I'm in the building where the Blue Sky meeting was in that you went to. But I often like to walk over to the other buildings, but particularly the Health Span building, because there's a large NIH project going on in there, the NIH meaning National Institute of Health. And it's kind of about what you're talking about. So what they are interested in, the problem we're addressing is, why is it in older folk, and I don't mean, nigh on to death, I mean older folk, maybe over 60, let's say, that some respond so beautifully to a well-structured exercise program, especially focused in this case on resistance training, but also has the other components. And a well-structured, scientifically validated program, some people respond just remarkably well. And others, they get a little better, but not much. And for years it was always, they did the wrong thing, or they weren't motivated, they weren't really pushing hard. So we proposed to NIH that these people would be intensely trained, and if we, obviously if they're not motivated, we would get them out of the program. And it's a big program with 2 other sites. We're the main site, but there's also 2 other sites. One of the other sites is in Florida at the University of Florida at Gainesville. And I think there are 400 participants here and 200 there and 200 in Oklahoma. And we took every kind of imaginable biomarker. We took muscle tissue on these people so we know their fiber types. We took blood. We did genetics. And we want to know what could cause this difference in response? And then more importantly, if you did know that, maybe there's a way to mitigate that. Maybe there's a way to train people. And everybody's not the same. It might be that a different training regime would work better. And so this is really, really interesting. And, people talk about space flight as being like accelerated aging is how it's often described, the effect on the human body. And in a way it is, in some ways, but in other ways it's just completely unique. So on Earth, as we age, particularly as you get, pretty far along, what you're losing in terms of muscle is mostly your fast twitch and the motor neuron units and the fast twitch fibers themselves. And it starts to convert to slow twitch. And this is problematic. When you're out of balance, and balance is one of the things, lack of balance comes along a little bit with age. You can fight it, and there are things you can do to prevent that loss to some extent. But it does happen. But when it happens to a young person, they're quick enough, they recover so seamlessly that an observer could hardly tell that they were quite a bit out of balance. Whereas an older person, think in your memory of your experiences with older people, if they stumble, they almost like run forward a little, like they have to sort of catch themselves because we've lost our fast twitch ability. And this is why an athletic older person, you can see them if they're a strong athletic older person, like a former power athlete of some kind. If you have them, say, on the leg press machine, they can press the whole stack even in their mid-70s, but they can't jump at all because they've lost power. And so finding ways to retain power in older people is really important. And in space, it's exactly the opposite. So in space, what we lose at a tremendous rate is our slow twitch muscles, starting with the slowest. So the muscles that we use to just keep ourselves upright, we don't even think about them. Just why aren't we just jellyfish? The anti-jellyfish muscle. What they really are is anti-gravity muscles. And since there's no gravity, those muscles are just shut down, right? And so I do find it fascinating. But I think that project is really potentially important, looking at the various responses that people have to training as they age and what could be done about it.
Looking through an evolutionary lens, why do you think we lose our fast twitch muscles specifically when we age?
I don't know. I would have to give that some thought. And I often do look at things through an evolutionary lens. That's one of my favorite lenses. It's hard to say. There's a lot of things that happen to us as we age that there's not any evolutionary benefit. The assumption was that, you'd be off the planet by then. I think evolution is optimized for reproductive success and for passing on genetic material. You see somebody in their 70s, I don't know how much evolution cares about. Cares is the wrong word, right? I'm anthropomorphizing something that's not anthropomorphic, but it's not optimized for that function. But I have to give that more thought.
You mentioned the NIH study, and then the, like you said, the kind of duplicate of DARPA that was looking at the health side. What's interesting to me is when I do look back and look at evolution of man, look at, us when we were in small villages and the way that we just literally pulled food from the ground or hunted, the way that we exercised, the way that we just had fire, no electricity. So we probably got sleepy and slept through the night. It seems to me that a lot of the answers to our challenges could be literally answered by, well, let's do what we did 200-300 years ago. So some areas, require innovation and invention and that kind of thing. But I almost feel like regression in some areas are also the answer.
Yeah. Your grandmother knew a lot. And, people have religious wars now about what food to eat. I never heard any of that until the last 30 years. People all knew, and I think the diet wars are an example of what you're talking about. You're talking more broadly, but think of it's the same. It's the same thing. Um, I'm often told that we should marvel at all our recent advances, and people like to say that in the last 5 years, or the last 10 years, we've advanced more than the last 200 years. And I really think that's predominantly nonsense. Think of what your grandmother went through, or my grandmother, what she saw. My grandmother went from no heavier than air flight. I mean, heavier than air flight, television, computers, just routine flight, airlines. People are zipping around the world. And we're so consumed that we've made so many advances. I think it's some form of misplaced hubris. I was at a party once in Silicon Valley, and everybody was very impressed with a young guy at the party. And I asked, well, what did he do? I thought maybe he, I don't know, had cured some disease or something, And he invented the like button. Okay, great. This is what's come of our culture.
Speaking of innovation, one of the interesting conversations I had with a couple of guys from CoolMit a long time ago now was they had also been in NASA, and the development of all these different materials and communication devices. And I was telling them in the fire service, not only now are we discovering that our gear has PFAS, so there's actual, carcinogenic material in our gear itself, but also the gloves are notoriously thick. They're so hard to actually tie knots in to operate the radio. And then the radios themselves, when it comes to getting in an elevator, all of a sudden the signal's gone. That was an issue with 9/11. A lot of the communication challenges that resulted in firefighter deaths. When it comes to technologies that you've seen in the space world, are there any materials or innovations you think that the fire service would benefit from if there was that cross-pollination?
I frankly don't know. Gloves are a big problem in space as well. Presumably, we're talking about human space flight, and the environment in which they operate is so different. I think what would be a beneficial crosstalk is more with respect to how you schedule people, the scheduling, the importance of focusing on performance, both cognitive and physical, the sense of esprit de corps and eliteness. I mean, I think the fire service ought to be treated. First of all, I think they should have very high standards to get in and stay in, and should be treated appropriately and compensated appropriately, and treated as if they matter, and I'm not sure that's the case in most instances. And that's something that could be learned from the NASA experience. But in terms of the actual technologies, I have to think about that more. There's a lot of tremendous work in the agency that never sees the light of day. It's in some lab somewhere, and if it doesn't fit a NASA problem naturally enough, it goes away. But some of that, like on the rebreathers and some of that side of it, I think there's probably overlap.
I want to hit one more area of technology, then we'll go to some closing questions, so I'll make sure I'm mindful of your time. I think it was at Morley, I forget. Someone did a presentation at IHMC in Ocala a few months ago, and they were talking about robotics, the exoskeletons, and in that particular case, it was cleanup in nuclear, disaster spills, whatever the term would be. But it was an interesting thought when it came to the application on the military side, on the first responder side, to load bear so that these men and women could get to a certain point without being exhausted. So talk to me about that technology.
Exactly. I think that technology is very relevant to the firefighting community and also to the military community. Firefighters are, years ago when we were thinking about the exoskeleton world, we talked about firefighters as being an ideal application in many ways. And at the time, exoskeletons, were still so difficult and not even close to ready for prime time. But that's what research is, right? Research is a process of it's a continual iterative process, and things get better. And now exoskeletons are much better than they were. Now, the project you're talking about is for the Department of Energy. And the Department of Energy has controls and operates the old bomb sites, DOD sites. And some of these are phenomenally unhealthy places to be. And so the folks who are doing the cleanup work are wearing a lot of protective gear and breathing apparatus and heavy gear in general for radiation protection. And this is an older workforce. I think the average age is 62, average 62.
Wow.
And next year it'll be 63 because there's no one coming in on the bottom, right? Young people don't say, hey, that's what I want to do, It's a problem. And they have very short work. They can work, I think it's 20 minutes on some of these projects before they're wiped out and have to be taken off the job, cool down, take off the gear. So it's not real productive. And the idea is to use exoskeletons to reduce the repetitive motion injuries, but also to power them so they can do more work. And I can imagine in the fire service, an exoskeleton, you're talking about going up lots and lots of stairs and having to take someone down, perhaps. My goodness, that would be a good application. Offload the burden. And in the future, I think that will in fact happen. We've also developed exoskeletons for paraplegics. But in many ways, I think the application in the fire service is potentially a good one. But again, it will require change in the fire service. An exoskeleton is a complicated device, even if they continue to advance at a rapid pace as they are. I think most fire services would go, okay, put that thing in the corner. In other words, it would require a cultural change where people were happy to have the training to know how to use it properly. And some people would be, not everyone would have to be trained in it, but, it would, I think it would require institutional change as well as cultural.
I had Richard Browning on the show about 3-4 years ago now. He's the one that did the kind of jet propulsion that he holds in his hands and literally flies like Iron Man. But one of the interesting applications is wilderness medicine. So someone gets hurt on a mountain, they can literally fly a paramedic to that person. And then because of aviation laws, they can't fly the person down. But they then were talking about, well, you could get a drone that could take the stretcher down to the ambulance, and then obviously then human people, move that over to the ambulance. But so the potential of some of these technologies, I think, is exciting because, as we said with AI, you're making the humans better at what we do, and the bedside manner and the critical thinking. These are all things that you need a person for. Even if you use AI to suggest it, you still need to make sure that makes sense. And then that bedside manner, that's really what separates us from a machine, is how you treat someone. But to use some of these technologies to make a rescue faster or, extricate a patient faster, I think that's where it's really exciting in the first responder professions.
I think so too. And you'll see that first, I think, in the military. But I think it's very exciting. You can see... everyone talks about it, everybody's aware of it, but just in the war in Ukraine, there was recently a Ukrainian advance not involving humans, right? So they actually took a position with, I don't know of any other cases, they had ground robots and drones, and the humans are operating them from some location, but, and a lot of what ground robots will be doing, and also airborne large drones and ground robots, will be extricating people too, taking people away from the front.
Yeah, it's amazing. Well, one more area before we go to the closing questions, just because you kind of alluded to it. One of the things that I found was the biggest challenge to my performance as a firefighter, especially as I worked in Southern California and Southern and Central Florida my whole career, and I'm from England, was simply overheating. And our gear is designed to keep the heat out from the outside, but then consequently it keeps the heat in, and we cook like a little burrito. So what about cooling technologies? Have you had any of those come across your desk, whether it's on the, the special operations side or even the space side?
Yes. In fact, both communities have various approaches to cooling, as do race car drivers as well. And it's crazy that we cook people that have to be making good decisions. Do you remember earlier I complained about the slime suit in wrestling?
Yeah.
You're cooked in that thing, and I think firefighters are frequently cooked in their clothes. And unlike the slime suit, it's probably even less enjoyable. The good thing about the slime suit is I had a fancy one that had a valve on the wrist area, and it's so full of perspiration that you can hear it sloshing. And if someone annoyed me, I could open the valve and slap my forearm, and they would get a geyser. So you could sort of squirt gun people with your slime suit, and people did not like that.
So what are some of the technologies that you're seeing that are combating that then?
Well, there's a variety of cooling technologies, water cooling and others. I've seen them in the race car community, and of course, in DoD, we have some work here. I can't go into any detail, but related to hands and keeping hands cool, like for halo jumps, that kind of thing. And then NASA, of course, regulates the temperature inside the spacesuits, and it's absolutely critical that you do that in space, of course. In space, the temperature swings are so extreme that you have to be really on top of that, not just for the human, but also all aspects of it. The fuels, the fuel that they're planning to use in the lunar lander is cryogenic, and this stuff's like 100. It's a 2-component fuel: liquid oxygen and methane. The methane, I think, is kept at 161 below 0 centigrade, and the liquid oxygen, I think, is 180 below 0 centigrade. And of course, due to sun activity and due to thermal losses, these things start to boil, and they boil off. So, cooling is something that that particular agency is very, very big on, both for humans and for the machines.
Brilliant. All right. Well, the first of the closing questions. Is there a book, or are there books that you love to recommend? It can be related to our discussion today, which was very diverse, or completely unrelated.
Most of my favorite books were written a long time ago, are, philosophical treatises. I read a few years ago a humorous book. I think it was called On Being Dead or something like that. It was funny. I actually read a lot of fiction because I read a lot of government reports, and it's not entertaining fiction, but they mostly are fiction. I'll give that more thought. But yeah, I absolutely love books. I have a huge collection of books, and I'm trying to figure out what to do with them. I can't bear to not have them, but I know I don't need all these books. I've already read them. I'm trying to. That's the wonderful thing about iPads. When I go to Rome a lot, and I bring all these. I used to have to carry all this heavy luggage to bring the architectural and the history and stuff books I wanted to refer to when I was in Rome. And now you can put almost all of them on an iPad. And so that's just been a boon for somebody like me that likes to travel with books.
Why do you go to Rome a lot? Is it simply because you love the city, or is there a business side too?
No, it's there's something about Rome that's special, and in many ways it's a very annoying place. But there's something special about it for me. I like the vibrancy woven through an ancient place, and sort of outdoor museum in a sense. and culture. Culture's changed, of course, as it become inundated with tourists. But I'm very fond of the role of Rome and also Florence, and then of course England played in the development of and other countries, but in the development of the Western civilization. I think we've lost our way so profoundly. We don't seem to understand the importance and value of what had been developed and the beauty of it, and so much the worse for us.
I've said this many times, whether it's the lessons of kindness and compassion and the horrors of war, or whether it's, the lessons on physical health or mental health, we are a very arrogant time in, human history, where certainly when I was a little bit younger, there was a complete rebuking of any ancient wisdom. Now, I think we're finally circling around again. But, modern medicine, for example, of which there are some obviously phenomenal innovations and, life-saving technologies. But yeah, the way that it's like, oh, no, you need a pill for this. No, this is what we were talking about with the GLP-1s. And so I feel like, I hope the pendulum's swinging back the other way, because there's a reason why for thousands of years these humans were trying to pass on the lessons, because they were tried and tested, and they were hoping they would leave a cautionary tale for the next generation.
Yes, I agree. And it seems that we've gotten to a place where I'm not sure what the right description is, but we somehow have a lot of self-loathing culturally. It's pretty much forbidden to teach the Renaissance art or to teach Shakespeare at a university. I mean, there's sort of a collective madness, and it's somehow a deeply indoctrinated self-loathing, and it's very unhealthy for the civilization as a whole. And I'm concerned about that for sure. And it'll take a while. I mean, I hope it swings the other way, but it's unclear. The institutions of our culture seem very committed to this self-loathing.
Yeah. I've got a feeling we're going to find ourselves in the middle. I think even now, the middle voice was the most censored for a long time. You could pick on a number of things recently, whether it was COVID or, the George Floyd thing or whatever. And I think people now are realizing, well, that's where, the normal people are, for lack of a better word. So, come to the middle, and you're going to find people that pretty much have the same values as you, that, want to enjoy their kids, watch them grow up, eat good food, have a healthy, as you said, high performing life, not worry about being bombed. It's a pretty common denominator there. So I think if we can refine what's most important again, rather than your labels, then I think we'll find our way again.
Yeah, I hope so.
Well, what about film, television, or documentaries that you love?
I don't own a TV. I haven't for a long time. I think the TV is our primary zookeeper. If you think of us as zoo humans, and most of us are definitely zoo humans. Desmond Morris, I think, came up with that term. He was a Brit. He wrote a book about it. But from my perspective, TV is one of our primary zookeepers. There are lots of zookeepers, but that's one. And so I never watch TV, except you almost can't go out to eat these days unless it's like a Michelin restaurant without a TV in your face. And when I do glance at it, and it's hard not to look at it because you have something moving. Humans look at moving things, in front of them. And you look at it and you realize, oh my God, if this is representative of the culture, this is not good news. I guess maybe that's why I like Wyoming so much. If you go to a restaurant and the TV's on, it has rodeo on, not some crazy thing. And there are not TVs everywhere. But so yeah, I don't watch TVs. Period. I don't go to movies. The last movie I went to was 1976, I think. It was the original Star Wars. Star Wars, the original Star Wars. And the people in the theater were such rude. I mean, they're all, like shouting, like they're participating in the movie and, yelling. I thought, okay, this is great. So no TV, no movies.
All right. Well, the next question, is there a person you'd recommend to come on this podcast as a guest to speak to the first responders, military, and associated professions of the world?
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, I can think of a whole handful of them. I'll email you some, but right now, I think Eric Ross would be a great get. If you could snag Eric. He's a former unit guy, great reputation, and he's doing a startup now related to human performance, mostly related to using, I'll let him explain it, but using a new approach to rehabilitating joints. So I think Eric would, be of real interest to your listenership. If you're interested in the combat casualty care at all, and sort of ultimate get, I think, would be Frank Butler. So he's a friend and a colleague. He lives here. Frank is the author of the whole combat casualty care doctrine that's used everywhere in the military now. He was a Naval Special Warfare doc as well, an operator first and then later a doc. I think Frank Butler would be a super good choice for the community that you're reaching out to. And then, and maybe somebody from DARPA, maybe not a current DARPA person because they would have all kinds of restrictions, but like a former DARPA program manager working on relevant work would also be good. But Eric Ross and Frank Butler are sort of no-brainers.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think they'd both be incredible. So see if we can figure out how to make that happen. So thank you. All right. Well, then the last question before we make sure everyone knows where to find you. What do you do to decompress?
What do I do to decompress?
Yes.
Oh, boy. So I like to, I mentioned Wyoming. I like to hike in Wyoming and ride my bicycle. But in particular, I love the mountains. And here in Florida, I go to the ocean. So we live near the ocean and go to the ocean. Nature is my best decompression valve, I think. Nothing seems as potent to me as the forest. Even the beach isn't as potent for me as a deep primal forest, with massive trees that have never been cut. And I love the forest, particularly I love it in the winter when you hear the trees creaking and groaning in the cold, and there's no one anywhere near you. Behind my house in Wyoming, the next building is like over 100 miles. So it's just nice. You can just walk, and you don't have to walk far, and you feel different. You feel I feel human. So Wyoming for me is it reminds me of in one way it reminds me of a way the United States used to be, and in another way I just like being in the forest.
It's funny how often I get the same answer, and it's the same for me as well. Crescent Beach, just south of St. Augustine, is definitely one of my recharge places. And, I grew up on a farm in England, so when I go home there, the green and the trees and the rolling hills. And it's what we said about, turning the clock back in some areas, getting away from the concrete jungle taps you back into, the primal man.
I agree. I think we've lost connection with our humanity and what it is to be a human. In many ways, we focus so much on the technology and the gadgets. We've lost track of just being a good human. There was a paper that drove me nuts maybe 10 years ago where they were comparing grip strength in the fathers and the sons. And the fathers were like tremendously stronger than the sons. Well, these are adult sons. Well, a young man should not be tremendously weaker than his father, and it was frustrating to read it and to realize, that not that grip strength's everything, but it's part of being a functional human. And the gap between men and women had shrunk a lot, not because the women had gotten stronger, which would be great, but the men had become weaker. And then when I contacted the people who did the study, they too were aghast, but not for the reason I was aghast. So I became even more annoyed once I talked to them, because their answer was, well, we need to re-norm everything because now everyone's weak, not to fix people from being weak. Their answer was, we need to change what the standards are as it's reflected in the study. This is kind of like what they did with testosterone levels, right? So they keep lowering and lowering and lowering what normal is, but Homer Simpson is normal, right? You don't want to be normal in today's world. So I think it's important to be a good human, a functional, capable human, and that's slipping away.
I do a free class for first responders every Monday, and we'll do a lot of the strongman stuff, and a lot of the guys that I train also do the classes in the gym, 3 times a week as well. But we'll do farmers carries or whatever, and they're good, they're strong, they're definitely not bringing that bar down. But the realization I tell them is, like, we just did 200 meters carrying this. There are people all over the planet that will carry the same weight for miles. Men, women, sometimes even children. So it's up to us to not let that bar slip. So think about, what would I have had to have done, 100 years ago? And am I capable of maybe not doing it exactly, but at least kind of maintaining? Because I think this is a problem, is people just woefully underestimate the capabilities of the human body, not only its ability to heal itself when it's fed and moved properly and hydrated, but also on the side that we going back to performance, you see these elite athletes, like, no, that's what the human body is capable of. And you're saying you can't carry your groceries to your car, you need a cart. Like, how about you start carrying your groceries to your car?
Yeah, you just brought up one of the things that, over a relatively long life, I've noticed, as a former athlete, the gap between, let's take as an example college students, the gap between the strength, fitness, and functional movement of college athletes, let's say Division I college athletes, compared to the rest of the college students, is immense. They're like different species. And it didn't used to be that way. The gap was smaller. There was a gap, always, right? There always. I mean, athletes are athletes for a reason. But it wasn't like transcending the species. And now it's a remarkable gap. And you can see that in everyday life, like you were talking about. People feel mistreated if they have to carry their groceries very far, or any kind of inconvenience in life at all. And it's a shame, but I hope it corrects. And I particularly dislike when what they do is they lower the bar. And in our society, when there's a shortcoming, we tend not to mediate the shortcoming. We tend to lower the standard. So if in jump school people couldn't do 10 pull-ups or 5 pull-ups or any pull-ups, then you say, okay, there will be no pull-ups. We just hang. I remember in the Navy at one point, people were having a hard time hitting the target with handguns. This was at 25 yards, let alone hitting the bullseye. So they moved them closer. This kind of thing, or they moved them from 50 to 25. There's too much of that. There's too much. The adaptation is to re-norm. The norm is the goal. When you get a blood test and they tell you, oh, look, it's all in the normal zone, that says nothing about what it should be.
Exactly. Yeah, and this is the beautiful thing about the fire service is, people will talk about standards coming down or, making it easier for this group or that group, but the fire ground doesn't lie. The ladder stays the same weight. A person is the same weight. So it's the great equalizer. You either can or you can't. And there's, my profession, there's no business of lowering standards. So if we do, people die.
Yep.
It's that simple, whether it's the firefighters themselves, their partners, or the people that were there to rescue. So it's
well, you have a mechanism for reality to impinge, right? For reality to dictate success or failure. And we live in a very padded world generally. So most people's lives are not very much like that. And they rarely actually interact with reality. I mean, if you drop most people off in the middle of the forest, very shortly, they would be in deep, deep trouble.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, I want to be mindful of your time. So for people listening, if they want to learn more about IHMC or reach out to you, where are the best places online?
Well, we're easy to find. So it's the Institute for Human and Machine Cognition, or IHMC. Any web browser will take you there rapidly, and all kinds of information about me is available online. You can look me up on Wikipedia or whatever your favorite source is.
Brilliant. Well, I want to say thank you to Laurie and Tony Ortiz, who were the ones that really kind of brought me in initially, that you and I met. And I want to thank you. It's been such an incredible conversation. We've been all over the place, but your lens on all these different areas has been, fascinating. So I want to thank you so much for being so generous with your time and coming on the Behind the Shield podcast today.
Thank you, James. I enjoyed it. And I've listened to a bunch of episodes in your podcast and quite like it. So thank you for having me on.